Halloween crept in with a crisp wind, carrying the sense of autumn and the sound of whispered folklore. My family and I had been hearing rumors about a peculiar Halloween market that set up only once every 5 years, hidden away in the outskirts of town. They called it the Market of Eternal Flames. Intrigued by the tales, we decided to check it out, seeking a bit of festive mystery to spark up the season. We arrived just after dusk. The market was alive with eerie decorations, booths draped in shadowy cloth, and vendors who wore masks that looked far too realistic. Among the trinkets and charms, a peculiar stand caught my eye. The sign above it read, "Candles that never burn out." The vendor behind the counter, a tall, gaunt man with eyes as sharp as shards of obsidian, claimed that these candles could ward off evil spirits. "What makes these candles special?" I asked, unable to pull my gaze away from the flickering flames of the display candles. The vendor smiled a thin, almost predatory smile. "They don't just keep the spirits away," he said, his voice a low, menacing murmur. "They absorb the darkness within your home, feeding off it. They only go out when the darkness is gone." Curiosity got the better of us, and without much hesitation, we bought a set of 3. As we walked away, the vendor's words echoed in my mind, lingering like an unshakable chill. I tried to ignore it, pushing the odd feeling aside as we packed up and headed home. That night, we lit the first candle. Its flame glowed with an unusual intensity, casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. I felt a strange weight in the room, as if we weren't alone, but every time I looked around, nothing was there. Just the flickering light, dancing with a life of its own. And that's when we heard the first whisper, coming from somewhere deep within the house. The whisper was soft at first, almost like a draft stirring through the house. But it grew louder as the night wore on, transforming from a mere rustle to something more intentional. The words were too low to make out clearly, but every now and then, phrases slipped through the silence, chilling and cryptic. I could swear I heard my own name, stretched out in a slow, taunting echo. My husband looked at me, his eyes wide with unease. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the candle's crackling flame. I nodded, my skin prickling as the whispers turned into faint, hollow laughter, as though someone unseen found our fear amusing. It wasn't just eerie, it felt wrong, like the sound didn't belong in our house. The candle's flame flickered, casting shadows that stretched and swayed across the walls, forming shapes that seemed almost alive. The more I looked, the more I noticed how the shadows didn't align with anything in the room. They twisted and contorted, reaching out like clawed fingers stretching toward the light. Our daughter, Ella, peeked her head out of her room, rubbing her eyes. "Mom? Who are you talking to?" I opened my mouth to reassure her, but then I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. Just behind Ella, in the darkened hallway, a shadow slid across the floor, moving in a way that no shadow should. It didn't flicker or fade, it was dense, almost solid, creeping toward her like a living thing. Without thinking, I rushed over, pulling her close. "Just go back to bed, honey." "Everything's fine," I whispered, though my voice shook. But as I ushered her back to her room, I could still feel it, something lurking in the dark, feeding off the light, drawing closer with each second. The candle's flame burned brighter, casting harsher, deeper shadows, as if it was fighting off whatever unseen thing had taken an interest in our home. As I closed Ella's door, a soft scraping noise started from the walls behind me. The scratching was faint at first, like the gentle scraping of nails against wood. I thought it might be a mouse trapped in the walls, but as I pressed my ear closer, the sound intensified, growing more deliberate. Rhythmic. It was too slow, too deliberate, and it moved in a way that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I returned to the living room where the candle sat, its flame unnaturally still. My husband stood nearby, his face drawn and pale. "It's coming from inside the walls," he whispered, clutching his arms as if to ward off a chill that the room didn't actually have. Before I could respond, there was a loud thump right behind us. We both jumped, and my gaze whipped to the wall just beside the candle. There, a dark spot began to form, starting as a tiny pinprick and slowly spreading like ink bleeding through paper. What? What is that? I stammered, feeling the first real tremor of terror lodge in my chest. He shook his head, his eyes locked on the stain, watching it grow and writhe, as though it had a mind of its own. The candlelight cast an orange glow on the spreading shadow, illuminating a strange pattern forming in the darkness, something that almost looked like eyes, staring back at us. And then, without warning, a low moan echoed through the house. It was a sound that seemed to resonate through every wall, every corner, vibrating in my bones. I felt as though the very structure of the house was groaning under some unseen weight. Suddenly, the candle's flame flared high, casting a blinding, searing light. The scratching stopped, and silence fell heavy over the room. We stared at each other, breathless, neither of us daring to move. Finally, my husband broke the silence. Maybe we should blow it out, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. But as he reached for the candle, the flame flickered violently, resisting, as if alive, as if warning us not to extinguish it. We froze, and then, almost in response, the scratching began again. Only this time, it was louder, faster, like a frantic clawing trying to escape, or to get inside. The frantic scratching grew louder, more intense, seeming to come from all directions. It clawed at our ears, filling the house with a maddening rhythm that set our teeth on edge. Shadows began to thicken around the edges of the room, twisting into unnatural shapes that crawled and slithered along the walls, as if alive. Then, I noticed something that nearly stopped my heart. One of the shadows, a long, serpentine thing winding along the ceiling, didn't shift with the flicker of the candlelight. It remained fixed, growing darker and more distinct, like a physical entity. It hovered there, watching, and though it had no face, I felt its eyes on me. "We need to leave," I whispered, grabbing my husband's arm. "Whatever's here, it's feeding off the light. We shouldn't be here." Then, from somewhere deep in the house, there came a sound, soft at first but unmistakable. It was the faint cry of our daughter, Ella. "Mommy?" Her voice was distant, echoing down the darkened hallway, weak and trembling. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. I had put her to bed. I was sure of it. "Ella," I called, my voice thick with dread. I took a step toward the hallway, but my husband grabbed my arm, his face drained of color. "Wait," he whispered, his eyes wide. "Listen." The house fell silent again, so quiet that I could hear the faintest creak of the floor beneath my feet. And then, from the darkness, her voice came again, this time closer, more insistent. "Mommy. Daddy. Help me." The cry was hollow, as if echoing from a place much further away than just down the hall. I looked at my husband, fear twisting in my stomach. "That doesn't sound like her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But before we could decide what to do, the candle flame flickered violently, casting the room into a whirl of shadows. The shadows lengthened, stretching toward the hallway like dark, skeletal fingers beckoning us to follow. It was as if the light was guiding us, pulling us deeper into the darkness, daring us to step forward. With a shared look of terror, we took a few tentative steps toward the hallway, the candlelight flickering behind us. We could hear her voice again, desperate, frightened, calling from the shadows. It was drawing us further, luring us into the unknown. And that's when we heard the sound, soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Behind us, in the flickering glow of the candle, something was breathing. The breath was low, ragged, and disturbingly close. We froze, afraid to turn around, but every instinct screamed that something was standing right behind us, just out of sight, waiting. My husband gripped my hand tightly, his knuckles white. Don't look back," he whispered, his voice trembling. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my chest, and forced myself to take a step forward. If we could just get to Ella's room, maybe we could. But then I heard it my name, whispered in a voice that sounded like my mother's, soft and familiar but warped, hollow, as if being spoken through layers of ice. Please. Don't leave me here. My blood ran cold. My mother had died years ago, but the voice was unmistakable. Against my better judgment, I turned my head, just a fraction, enough to catch a glimpse. And there, hovering just beyond the candlelight, was the faint silhouette of a figure, a woman, her face obscured, her eyes dark pits that seemed to pull all light into them. She was reaching out, her fingers elongated and skeletal, straining toward me with a horrible desperation. I gasped, stumbling back. My husband grabbed my arm, pulling me around to face the hallway. Don't look. Just keep moving, he said, his voice tight with fear. But the breath behind us grew louder, ragged and labored, as if whatever was there was becoming more solid, more real. We rushed down the hall, the whispers and breaths following us, wrapping around us in a cacophony of familiar voices twisted into something monstrous. I could hear my father's voice, my childhood friend's laughter, even the echoes of my own voice from some forgotten memory, calling to me with a sweetness that felt like poison. Finally, we reached Ella's door. I threw it open, expecting to find her huddled in bed, crying for help. But the room was empty, silent except for the faint, dying echo of her voice. Mommy. I spun around, frantic, my heart sinking into a well of dread. The hallway stretched before us, impossibly long, filled with shadows that moved and shifted like liquid darkness. The candle flame from the living room still burned, but it was smaller now, weaker, as if something was draining its strength. Then, just as I was about to call out for Ella, the closet door in her room creaked open. My husband and I turned slowly, our breath caught in our throats. There, half hidden in the shadows, we could see her Ella, standing motionless, her eyes wide and glassy, staring back at us. Ella? I whispered, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, as if frozen. But then her mouth opened, and in a voice that was not her own, she whispered, "Blow out the candle." The words "blow out the candle" hung in the air, chilling us to the core. Ella's mouth moved, but the voice that came out was hollow, ancient, carrying a weight that felt heavy enough to crush the room. My husband and I looked at each other, the horror in his eyes reflecting my own thoughts. Blowing out the candle was the last thing we wanted to do. Ella, sweetheart, come here, I said, reaching out, hoping to snap her out of this trance. But she didn't move, didn't blink. Her eyes remained vacant, fixated on something I couldn't see, somewhere beyond us, as if she were staring into the depths of a dark, endless void. She whispered again, her voice layered with 100 other voices, each one echoing the same command, each one more urgent, more desperate. Blow it out. My husband clenched his fists, his face pale. We can't blow out the candle. That's what it wants, he whispered, barely able to get the words out. But before I could respond, Ella stepped out of the closet, her movements slow and unnatural, as if some invisible force were guiding her limbs. She approached us, her gaze unblinking, her lips parted ever so slightly. And then, to my horror, she raised a hand and pointed toward the living room, where the candle's flickering light barely held back the dark. You have to blow it out, she said, but her mouth didn't move this time. The words echoed around the room, filling every corner, seeping into the walls. And then, almost imperceptibly, the candle's flame in the living room began to dim. Shadows closed in, thick and suffocating, swallowing the light inch by inch. My heart hammered, and I could feel a cold, oppressive weight settle over us, as if something ancient and malevolent had finally found its way into our home. Suddenly, the whispers started again, louder this time, more insistent, filling the air with a dark, mocking chant that twisted and overlapped in a chorus of sinister harmony. They seemed to be coming from the walls, the floors, even the very air we breathed. Ella stepped closer, her face void of emotion. She reached up, her small hand gently touching my cheek. Her skin was cold, far too cold. It won't leave until the light is gone, she murmured, her voice laced with sorrow. Tears blurred my vision as I looked down at my daughter, at the hollow thing that looked like her but felt like something else entirely. I could feel my resolve weakening, my hands trembling with a horrible certainty. Whatever we'd invited in, it would not rest until we obeyed. I don't know if I can do this, I whispered, clutching my husband's hand, desperate for any sliver of comfort. But before either of us could decide, Ella's head snapped toward the hallway, her eyes widening as if seeing something terrifying lurking in the darkness. "It's here," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. And then, in the candle's dying light, we saw a figure, standing just beyond the doorway, its face obscured in shadow, watching us with eyes that glowed with a faint, unnatural light. The figure stood silently, just at the edge of the dying light. Its eyes glowed faintly, 2 pinpoints of cold, unnatural light that seemed to pierce through the shadows, locking onto us. It was tall, impossibly so, its form stretching up to the ceiling, its limbs long and thin, almost like shadowy branches clawing out into the room. I couldn't breathe, my chest tight with terror as those eyes fixed on us, unblinking, patient, as if it had all the time in the world. It didn't move, didn't speak, just watched, waiting for us to make the next move. The whispers grew louder, a relentless chant that seemed to come from everywhere, urging us, tempting us. My husband whispered, "Don't let it get closer to the candle. Whatever you do, don't let the light go out." But Ella stepped forward, her small face reflecting the dim, flickering glow of the candle. Her voice was soft, almost pleading. "It just wants to be free, Mommy. It needs the light. It needs you to end it." A shiver ran down my spine. She spoke as if she understood it, as if she were in communion with it. But I could see something in her eyes and innocence buried deep under the hollow stare, a tiny spark fighting against whatever force had taken hold of her. "Ella, come back to me," I whispered, reaching out to her. But as I took a step, the figure moved, gliding silently into the room with a fluidity that made my skin crawl. It drifted closer, its form bending and stretching unnaturally, moving with a silent, predatory grace. The candlelight seemed to dim further, flickering as if struggling to hold its ground against this dark presence. Desperate, I grabbed the other 2 unlit candles from the shelf and held them out to my husband. "Light them," I hissed. "Maybe it'll keep it back." With shaking hands, he struck a match and lit the first candle. Instantly, the shadows around us recoiled, shrinking away from the expanding light. But as soon as the flame caught, the figure let out a low, guttural hiss, its face twisting into a mask of rage. It moved closer, faster now, as if angered by our defiance. "Like the last one, now!" I shouted, gripping Ella's hand, pulling her close to me as the dark figure loomed, filling the room with a thick, oppressive cold. My husband lit the 3rd candle, and for a brief, blessed moment, the room was filled with light. The figure staggered back, its form wavering, distorting like smoke caught in a gust of wind. Its eyes flared with fury, and the whispers erupted into an ear-splitting shriek that seemed to shake the very walls of the house. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but an icy chill lingering in the air. The room was silent again, save for the crackling of the candle flames. I sank to the floor, clutching Ella, who looked up at me, her eyes clear and confused, as if waking from a terrible dream. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice small and scared. I hugged her tightly, relief flooding through me, but in the pit of my stomach, a cold dread remained. The figure was gone. But the candles were still burning, their flames unnaturally steady. And in that silence, a single thought chilled me to the bone: the darkness had not left. It was simply waiting. The silence in the house was oppressive, thicker than any quiet I'd ever felt. I held Ella tightly, watching the 3 candles flicker with a strange steadiness, their light casting sharp, rigid shadows across the room. My husband knelt beside me, his eyes darting nervously between the doorway and the candles. Though the figure had vanished, a sense of dread lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. Ella, still wrapped in my arms, trembled slightly. "Mommy." "It was here," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "It whispered to me." It wanted me to. Her words trailed off, her gaze shifting to the candles, her eyes widening with a new realization. What did it want, honey? I asked gently, though every part of me feared the answer. She hesitated, her small face pale in the candlelight. It wanted me to tell you to blow them out. It said, if the light goes out, it can finally be free. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at the candles again, understanding now why they hadn't gone out. It wasn't just about keeping the darkness at bay. These candles were traps, containing something much older, much darker than I'd ever thought possible. My husband looked at me, his face etched with fear and confusion. We have to keep them burning, he said, almost pleading. If they go out, whatever that thing is, it'll be unleashed. A faint whisper drifted through the room, a sinister murmur, like distant voices layered over each other. It was coming from the walls, from the very air around us. The darkness wasn't gone, it was simply waiting, watching, biding its time until the last flame died. Then, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the whispers grew louder, forming words in an ancient, guttural language that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The flames flickered wildly, as if buffeted by an invisible wind, and I could feel the darkness pressing closer, coiling around us like a serpent. Desperate, I stood up, gathering Ella in my arms. We can't stay here, I whispered to my husband. We have to leave. Now. He nodded, grabbing his coat and keys, and we made our way toward the door, each step feeling heavier, as though something unseen was pulling us back. The shadows seemed to stretch toward us, reaching with clawed, skeletal fingers, desperate to hold us in their grasp. But as we reached the front door, I hesitated. The candles still burned, casting their fragile light against the darkness. If we left, and they went out, whatever that thing was would be released. I felt torn, paralyzed by the weight of the decision. Mommy, please, Ella's voice broke through my thoughts, her eyes filled with tears. We have to go. I took a deep, shuddering breath, then nodded, pulling her close as I opened the door. Just as we stepped over the threshold, the lights in the house flickered once more, and I heard a low, malevolent laugh echoing from the shadows, as if mocking our attempt to escape. We hurried to the car, not daring to look back. But as we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching our house shrink into the distance, its windows dark except for a faint glow from the living room. The 3 candles still burned, their light barely visible, but I could sense it. The darkness was stirring, waiting for the moment when the flames would die, and it would finally be free. We spent that night huddled together in a cramped motel room on the outskirts of town. None of us slept. I could still feel the weight of the house, the darkness that had latched onto it, lurking just at the edges of my mind. I kept glancing at the clock, each minute dragging by with agonizing slowness, my imagination conjuring images of the candle's flames shrinking, weakening, and finally going out. At some point past midnight, my husband's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He reached for it, his face going pale as he read the screen. He turned it toward me, his hand trembling. It was a notification from our home security camera app. Motion detected in the living room. We stared at the screen as a live feed flickered into view, barely able to breathe. The living room appeared as it should, dimly lit, with shadows cast by the 3 candles on the coffee table. But there was something wrong, something deeply, horribly wrong. The shadows weren't random anymore. They had taken shape, forming long, sinewy limbs and hollow, staring faces that drifted across the walls, crawling toward the flames as though drawn to them. The figures twisted and pulsed, merging and separating, clawing at the air with skeletal fingers that left dark smudges on the walls. And then we saw it, the figure from earlier, taller, darker, and more defined than ever. It stood directly behind the candles, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence as it reached a hand out, fingers stretching toward the flames. No. I whispered, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. It's trying to extinguish them. As we watched, the figure's hand hovered over the first candle, casting it into shadow. The flame sputtered, its light shrinking to a tiny spark, barely clinging to life. I gripped my husband's hand, helpless and horrified, watching as the figure leaned closer, its face twisting into a terrible grin. The first candle went out. The screen went black for a moment, and then the camera feed returned, now cast in deeper shadow. The second candle struggled, its flame flickering violently, shrinking with every second as more figures gathered around it, their hollow faces watching hungrily. In the darkness, we could hear a faint sound through the feed, a low, guttural chant, like a dark prayer, echoing through the house. With a final shiver, the second candle's flame died, plunging the room into near-complete darkness. Only the third candle remained, its small light fighting valiantly against the encroaching shadows. Ella whimpered, pressing closer to me, her small body trembling with fear. "Mommy, they're coming." I pulled her close, unable to tear my eyes from the screen. The third candle's flame burned bright, but the shadows pressed closer, tighter, closing in around it, absorbing every flicker of light. And then, just as the shadows seemed ready to consume it, the candle flared brilliantly, casting the room in blinding white light. For a brief, blessed moment, the shadows recoiled, writhing in agony, unable to touch the light. And then, with a quiet finality, the third flame went out. The screen went black. Silence filled the motel room, thick and unbroken, and I knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that whatever had been contained within those candles was free. Free to spread, to hunt, to follow. We sat in stunned silence, the air around us feeling colder, darker. The darkness had found us, and I knew, deep down, that there was nowhere left to run.